On the program now is Colin Kinniburgh, climate and environmental reporter for New York Focus. Welcome to the program, Colin.
Hey, glad to be here.
So it's been a busy couple of weeks for the governor. Before we get into the bills that were passed, let's talk about the governor's track record and when it comes to signing or rejecting bills.
Yeah, at the end of the year, there's always a flurry of bills that hits the governor's desk. The main part of the legislative session ends in June with hundreds and hundreds of bills passed. This year, it was close to 900, 896 to be exact. And then the governor has the second half of the year to review those bills and either sign or reject them. Things often get pushed to the last minute. So the last few weeks of the year, we often see a lot of bill signings and vetoes, and even just in the days leading up to Christmas and New Year's. So this year was no exception. Governor Hochul signed the vast majority of the bills, as she and her predecessors generally have. But she also made it clear that she's not afraid to wield her veto pen and reject bills that she doesn't like. Her office actually put out a statement just before Christmas talking about what she called, or what they called, some extreme legislative proposals that they rejected and others that they made changes to. If we want to be exact, she vetoed 115 bills this year out of those almost 900 and made substantial changes negotiated behind the scenes. Those are called chapter amendments to almost another 100 bills. So altogether, she's actually, despite that statement and coming out swinging with those fighting words, basically, she actually hasn't vetoed quite as many bills as some of her predecessors. Cuomo and Hochul's other former governors actually vetoed a larger share of bills, but Hochul has been very eager to seek those chapter amendments, as I mentioned, which often have been quite substantial, making changes that sometimes supporters of these bills say actually gut the main substance of the bill. And in other cases, the changes that that Hochul's office is seeking are big enough that they reach an impasse, and that's often where you end up with a veto if she doesn't just veto them off the bat. So I would say that's been the overall trend with Hochul so far. Her first year, she was projecting being very conciliatory, making lots of chapter amendments and vetoing very few bills. Now she's in full swing as an elected governor, and she's vetoing more bills, but still not quite as many as some of her predecessors.
Right. And one of the videos we talked about is vetoing the judicial nominations. So can you provide more insights into the governor's veto of judicial nominations and its sort of broader impact on the transparency?
Sure. So this was a bill about disclosing basically who was paying for lobbying on key judicial nominations. So over the past year, we had a very closely watched and heated fight over who was going to lead New York State's top court, the Court of Appeals. Governor Hochul's original nomination for that position didn't end up making it through. The Senate didn't approve his nomination, but there was a lot of tumult along the way and some spending from groups that got to be anonymous, basically, because there isn't a law around disclosing who's paying for those campaigns, unlike other campaigns for elected office in the state. So this was a bill that would have retroactively and moving forward, forced whoever's spending on that kind of lobbying to disclose it. Hochul rejected the bill, saying that it was basically too hard to implement, but she was still working to strengthen transparency in government. But I think we've seen some other decisions from her office that maybe call that into question a little bit. There was also a lot of attention this year around a bill that would have required LLCs, so shell companies in the state, to disclose their real owners. That was a bill that passed with a lot of support, and Hochul did end up signing a version of it, but she got some major changes that actually ended up meaning that the disclosures won't be public. Basically, the companies will have to disclose this to the state, but the state doesn't actually have to go and make that data open to the public. So a lot of the groups that supported the bill said that pretty much gutted the main intent of it. Who knows, there may still be ways to track down who's behind these shell companies, but that's one example of, I think that was seen as a big loss for transparency after that bill passed this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a question as a reporter, does that mean that those can be foiled now because they went to the state, or is there any way information other than other ways to get that sort of information?
Exactly. I would think that there could be a way through public records requests, and that's certainly an avenue we're interested in pursuing. Stay tuned to New York Focus.
Yes, definitely. So one of Governor Hochul's first veto of the year was on offshore wind transmission. So can we talk about how does this sort of decision impact New York's efforts to meet its climate goals, especially considering the recent economic challenges we've had and the political backlash she's faced?
Yeah, so this was another hotly contested bill. It faced a lot of pushback from Republicans, especially in both chambers of the legislature, but ended up passing this year with strong Democratic support. It was a bill that would basically allow an offshore wind company to put transmission cables through a beach on Long Island. So the beach is technically parkland, it's public land. So you have to go through a special process to basically sell any part of that land to a developer of any kind. And so this bill would have basically made it easier to get the power from the wind turbines off the shore of Long Island to New York City and to the rest of the state, basically. And the company, it's Equinor. It's a major European wind developer that is developing some of the big projects here off the coast of New York, said that this would be crucial to actually building their project, which was at the time the largest of the 4 offshore wind projects that were in the pipeline for New York State. Even after the bill was passed, there continued to be a lot of backlash, both from Republicans and eventually from some local Democrats. And sure enough, Hochul ended up taking some of those arguments that the critics were making about local control and vetoing the bill as her first veto of the year. So that was pretty surprising, or pretty striking at least, given the commitments that the governor and the state have publicly made to developing renewables in general and offshore wind specifically, which is baked into the state's climate law. Just a few days ago, actually, just as we were publishing this veto roundup, we learned that Equinor, the developer of this major wind project, has actually canceled its contract with the state to develop the project. They didn't mention the bill veto specifically, but I would have to imagine that was a factor, along with those broader economic headwinds you mentioned. Inflation has been a big issue for the renewable industry, as well as for the rest of the economy. Obviously, costs for labor and everything else that goes into the building renewable projects is going up, and the state declined to give these developers more money as they were asking for to build their projects. So that, along with vetoing this bill, I think made it very hard for the company to move ahead. So we'll have to see whether it gets replaced and what happens basically with whether New York is going to be able to build out offshore wind and renewables more broadly as quickly as it's supposed to meet its climate targets.
We were talking about like vetoes. We've seen like repeat vetoes, like the Grieving Families Bill vetoed for the second time. Why do you think the legislature persists in passing bills that will face veto, and what is that sort of dynamic at play here?
Yeah, we've seen this come up with a number of bills. I think the Grieving Families Act was one of the most prominent. That's a bill that would have made it possible for the families of victims of wrongful deaths to sue for emotional damages. This was a subject of a lot of attention last year when it was vetoed, and again this year, and the governor vetoed it again. We had something similar happen with an environmental bill that I've covered before around regulating certain kinds of streams, smaller streams, and whether they should get the same kind of protections that larger waterways in the state get. That was a bill that actually passed for the 3rd time this year. A version of it had passed under Governor Cuomo, got vetoed then because they said they didn't have the staff to basically enforce this. Governor Hochul made the same argument last year and the same argument again this year. I think the legislature basically is, especially with bills like that pass with overwhelming support, I think they are always looking for a way to get it through and maybe make slight changes every year, hoping that will be enough to, informed by whatever negotiations they've had with the governor's office the year before, and hoping that will be enough to get it over the finish line this year. But in both of these cases where I mentioned, clearly it wasn't enough and the governor vetoed it again. So we'll have to see whether they actually take another swing at them or whether they let these and other repeat vetoes go and just move on to other priorities. That's not clear yet.
What is the reasons behind the legislature repeatedly passing bills? Why haven't they been successfully overriding those vetoes?
Yeah, I think it's particularly interesting because since the elections in November 2020, Democrats have had supermajorities in both chambers, in the Senate and the Assembly, which means that if they really wanted to, they could override a veto from the governor. They could go back and pass that bill and just say they're ignoring the governor on this. But they have shown no interest in doing that. And Assembly Speaker Carl Hastie actually gave an interview about this, I believe, just last week. And what he said, he described veto overrides as nuclear options and said you would hope to never get to that point. I think the context we're looking at here is that the governor and the legislature always have to work together to get a legislation over the finish line. So I think neither of them right now are willing to take actions that are seen as overly hostile. And I think a veto override is seen as a very hostile way to get something passed, especially at the beginning of the year. Now we're heading into a very busy part of the legislative calendar, going into budget season, which is when some of the biggest ticket items in the state get passed. So I think the legislature is very hesitant to do something as dramatic as a veto override heading into budget season, where they know they're going to have to negotiate things with the governor and where the governor has a lot of built-in power just because of the way the budget is set up. Yeah, but we'll have to see if that ever changes, whether maybe there's a bill that the legislature feels strongly about that they would be willing to go for a veto override. We haven't seen it in, I couldn't tell you exactly how long. One of our reporters who's been covering Albany for 15 years says he hasn't seen a veto override since he's been covering this beat. So we'll see if that changes anytime soon. We've had some veto overrides in New York City Council recently, but I don't know if that trend is going to move to the state legislature anytime soon.
Now, like I said, New York Focus has a really deep dive into all the bills that were passed, and veto bills is a sort of a database really on New York Focus website. Some of the bills I just want to mention: disclosing lobbying and nominations, we talked about planned offshore wind transmission, campaign finance rollback, child care costs, non-competent agreements, non-religious addiction treatment, tropical deforestation, the investment, challenging wrongful convictions, stream protection, grieving families. So the whole list is there on New York Focus website. So now looking ahead, do you see the legislature making efforts to revisit and pass any of these veto bills, or you think Governor Hochul's final vote will be that's it?
I think very broadly speaking, it's very likely that the legislature will take another crack at some of them, probably not all of them. I think it's a little early to say yet which bills exactly. I haven't been able to report that out much, and I'm not sure my coworkers have yet either, but I'm sure we'll see some bills come up again for a third or even a fourth time, and others will get cast to the wayside. I thank you for mentioning the database we put together. We've talked about some of just a handful of examples here, and we have 10 bills that we covered, that we highlighted in our roundup. But I hope people can head to nysfocus.com, check out the website. We've got a comprehensive database of all the bills that got vetoed this year, and you can actually find the memos for each from Hochul's office explaining why they vetoed each bill, which is something that's very hard to find anywhere else online. So I hope people will check that out. And yeah, excited to see where things go from here, going into budget season. Again, as I mentioned, a very busy time, and whether Hochul kind of keeps up her style so far of being unafraid to challenge legislation that she doesn't like, and where that ends up taking New York State.
Absolutely. Colin, before we go, is there anything else I have not touched on you want folks to know about?
I think we covered it. Again, the bills we talked about are just the tip of the icebergs. Yeah, hope people can check out NYS Focus, New York Focus, and dig in more.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking to Colin, climate and environmental reporter for New York Focus. Let's say New York Focus has a big database on all the bills that were passed and vetoed and everything that Governor Hochul has been up to in Albany. So thank you so much for joining us on the program and really going over these new bills. Look forward to this new year, like you said, in the legislature to see what happens. So thank you so much, Colin, for joining us on the program.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.